Thank you, everybody, for joining our Virginia contract class. As you might know, at Keller Williams Capital Properties, we teach contract classes every month, and we alternate between teaching the Virginia contract, the DC contract, and the Maryland contract. So today we're actually teaching the core document for the Virginia contract, and then in subsequent trainings, we will be teaching either addendums, contingencies, or some of the other jurisdictions. But today we're focusing on the Virginia main contract. So this is supposed to be very interactive. So if you have questions or if you have a story or a best practice, if you do a lot of business in Virginia and are here to share best practices, please go ahead, unmute yourself or use the chat box, and we will be happy to hear your comments. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And before we get started, is there anything specific that one of you would like to learn today? Any particular aspects of the Virginia contract that you would like to make sure that we review? No, just general? Okay, sounds good. All right, so can you see my screen? Awesome, thank you, Kareem. All right, so this is the residential sales contract for Virginia, and we're going to go over kind of like each of the provisions and the main aspects of the pages, right? So it's 11 pages, and one of the good things about the Virginia contract is that a lot of the information that in DC or in Maryland you will have it scattered in different addendums. Virginia actually puts it all together in the main document. You have addendums, but all the core information will be in this document. So that is very helpful. So I just want to make sure that we're letting people, and Angel, you're letting people into the room, right? Okay.
Yes, I am on.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. So this form may only be used by realtors and other as authorized by NVAR. All other use is prohibited. Why do they have that in here? They have that in here because you always find that person that says, I know you're a realtor, can you give me a form, right? I want to sell my house to my tenant or to my cousin, and I don't want to, look for a contract. Can you give me your contract? If you are not representing somebody as a real estate agent, you're not authorized to provide this contract to anybody for their own use, right? So if your cousin wants to sell their house to your other cousin, then they have to hire an attorney or they have to go into ChatGPT or do whatever they want to get a contract. But unless you're representing either a buyer or a seller in a real estate transaction in NVAR, you are not authorized to give this form to anybody. So make sure that you keep that in mind. All right, so this sales contract is offer on, and that's when we're going to put the date of the offer, right? So if you're writing an offer today will go into that field between a buyer and a seller, okay? If you're not sure who is the seller, you have a couple of options. Sometimes the listing agent will provide in the disclosures a cover page with a specific information about the seller's name, or in the actual disclosures, which ideally the seller has signed in advance, there will be the name of the sellers. If you don't have that information, you can always go to the tax record, although the tax record is not as accurate as what the listing agent would provide or how the seller has signed the disclosures. So either the tax record or the information provided by the seller, by the listing agent, will go into who is the seller. If you are going to change the names, add people, you can always write an addendum at the end of or while you're under contract. For example, if you only put the name of your client as you normally address your client, but their name is a little bit different, you can change that in an addendum. But in the ideal world, what we would like to see is the final names the way that they would be officially recorded in this top portion of the document. That will alleviate you having to come back and fixing that later on. Okay, so the buyer and the seller are the parties to the contract. One of the things that I always say as a best practice is when you're performing real estate tasks, do not refer yourself as we. We think that the contract, the offer is too low, right? Don't use that we word, because you are actually not a party to the contract, right? Your name is not going to be on the buyer or on the seller side. And unless you are on the buyer or on the seller side, you should not be using the word we, right? My seller, my client, my buyer, right? The buyer thinks, the buyer believes. But don't use the word we, because if something goes wrong, then they are going to say, well, is this you speaking or is this your client speaking, right? So as a best practice, always say my client thinks, my client believes, whatever it is, but don't use the word we. All right. So these are the parties, and we're confirming that we're engaging in this real estate transaction with a listing brokerage representing the seller and a buyer brokerage representing the buyer. So if you're on the buy side, you would include the name of the brokerage here, which will be Keller Williams Capital Properties. And if you're a guest today and you work for another brokerage, then you would put the name of your brokerage in there. So representing the buyer. The listing brokerage and buyer's brokerage are collectively referred as brokers in consideration of the mutual promises and covenants set forth below and other good and valuable consideration, the property and sufficiency of which we acknowledge the parties agree as follows. So that the first item on the contract is the description of the real property. So for the description of the real property, you have all the following fields. You have the tax map ID, you have the legal description for the lot, section, subdivision, parking space, county, municipality, deed, page, street address, unit number, city, and zip code. So my word of caution here as a best practice, again, go back to the tax record. If the listing agent has not provided a cover sheet with all this information, a lot of listing agents will put all this in a cover sheet, but if they don't, go to the tax record and complete this section as much as you can, okay? If you don't have all the information, if you don't have the deed book and the page, it's okay to leave a couple of these blank, but as a best practice, that try to complete it as much as possible. The items that are really sensitive is the tax map ID. Don't leave that blank because that can create exposure to your client. And believe it or not, right, the parking space. We have had complaints where there is a misunderstanding on whether the property includes parking or not. So make sure that the parking space is actually completed. Okay, and then obviously you're going to include the street address, the unit number, city, and zip code. And again, if at any point you have questions, please unmute yourself and ask any questions. All right, section 2 is price and financing. You can use a percentage or an actual number, and everything is based on the sales price. So it says any percentage are percentages of the sales price that you're offering. So the sales price is what your client, not we, what your client wants to offer for the property, and you're going to put that number in there. And then for anything subsequent after that, you have the option to put a dollar amount or a percentage. So for the down payment, if there is no financing, the down payment will be the 100% of the sales price, right? So if your client is buying cash, then if on the top line under A you have $1 million, then the down payment will be 1 million, right? Or you could say 100% on the right. Don't use both fields. Don't say here 1 million and then put here 100%. Use either or, okay? If you're financing, the down payment will be the amount that your client is going to bring to the table in addition to the closing costs. So if they are putting 5% down payment, then you can put 5 here, and then under financing, you could put 95, okay? Financing, you have several options. There is a lot of confusion in terms of how people complete this. So if you're financing, you're going to complete the number one, right? First trust, conventional, VA, FHA, USDA, VA assumption, or other. For example, if it's a hard money lender, right? Or seller financing or something else. So you're going to include that amount in there. If the buyer is applying for a second trust, then you're going to use number two. Or if it's a seller held trust, you're going to use number three. But if you just have, let's say, 5% down payment and 95% financing, then you're going to be doing the 5% here, the 95% here, and then you're going to click, for example, there is a conventional loan, okay? And you're going to leave the rest blank. So if we're following the example, it will be 1 million, 5%, 95%, or whatever your client wants to put. In total financing, you have to put the addition of anything that is under C. So if you have more than one choice, right? Let's say that you have 90 here and 5 here, then the total financing is 95%, okay? If you don't have a second trust and everything is under the first trust, then you put 95% here and then 95% again here, okay? So we see a lot of confusion of how this section is used. Just make sure that you read it carefully so you're not making mistakes in there. All right, seller subsidy. This is one of my favorite things about the Virginia contract is that, again, on this first page, you're going to see the seller subsidy as well as anything that the seller is willing to pay for the buyer agent's compensation, right? In Maryland and Virginia and DC, those are additional documents and you have to be fishing for the information, but Virginia brings it all together in a very clear and concise way that you see on that first page. So if the seller is offering subsidy, you would put either an actual amount, let's say $10,000 or 2%, 3%, whatever number it is, that will go in there. And then if the seller is paying buyer broker compensation, the seller net will be reduced by. So again, if it's a flat number, it will go in this portion. If it's a percentage, it will go on this portion. As a best practice, let's say that you sign your buyer agency compensation indicating that your compensation is going to be X, and then the seller, and then you put that number here, right? Let's say that you're asking for X and the seller says, yes, we're willing to offer X, then your life is perfect and the seller is going to be paying for your whole compensation. If the seller agrees to a different number, let's say the seller is willing to offer Y and you have X in your agreement, you have to go back and obviously have a conversation with your buyer about what happens with the difference, right? So if you have X in your agreement and the seller is willing to offer Y, you have to talk to your client and say, hey, this is what the seller is willing to offer. You and I had agreed to this amount, which means that you have to cover the difference. If by any chance there is a conversation between you and your client that your client is not going to pay the difference, you have to go back and amend your buyer agency agreement, okay? So the ALTA, the closing disclosure, has to match what you have in your buyer agency agreement. So it's really important as a best practice that you keep all the documentation tight and organized. Any questions? Yes.
Yeah. Hello. I'm sorry to interrupt. When the in the buyer agency agreement, you specifically went over your compensation with your client, right?
Yeah.
So if they agree to the 2.5% or whatever it is, then they understand that if the seller is not willing to pay the 2.5%, then they're responsible for it. That's in the buyer agreement, correct?
Yeah.
So with that being said, if they signed off on the buyer agreement and they know they're responsible for the 2.5%, even though you may explain to them that, hey, you may get, if we get help from the seller, that's fine, but you're still responsible for what makes the difference. So my point is, so how would that need to change if you've already set the expectations up front that they're responsible for the full 2.5%?
Well, what I'm saying is if at the end the alta doesn't match. So if in the alta, and I'm just going to put random numbers because I think we have out of the brokerage guests, so we're not supposed to be discussing a specific compensation. But let's say that you had said in your buyer agency agreement that your compensation was 10%, right? And then in this document, you requested 10%, and the seller counters to 8%, right? And now there is a discrepancy. If in the alta it shows the seller paying 8 and the buyer paying 2, then that matches your agreement. You have a total of 10%. So you don't have to do anything, right? The alta matches your agreement. It doesn't matter where the 10 comes from, right? There is a combination for the 10. But if at the end of the day, it's only going to be 8, and the buyer says, I'm not going to pay the additional 2, then you have to go back and edit your agreement to reflect 8. Does that answer your question? Dennis? Okay, you're muted. I don't know if you're saying anything else. Okay.
Virginia, I have a quick question. I missed the part you said if the seller offers part of the commission, it will be subtracted from what figure?
From what you agree on your buyer agency agreement.
Thank you.
Yeah, remember, you're not signing your buyer agency agreement the day you write in the contract, right? Your buyer agency agreement has already been signed. So you can go ahead and request that the seller covers a portion of what you and your client had agreed, right? And depending on what's happening on the market, if it's a buyer's market, a seller's market, those numbers can fluctuate and can be very different depending on the market. But your buyer agency agreement gets signed at the very beginning where you agree. And sometimes there are 2 or 3 months that have lapsed between signing the buyer's agency agreement and you writing this contract. So that's why I say, as a best practice, it's always good to go back and have the conversation, because we have a lot of buyers that say, oh, I didn't understand that. I forgot. I didn't remember, right? So as a best practice, always have that conversation. All right.
Question, Cornelia here.
Hi, Cornelia.
Hi, Virginia. Shouldn't there be another line then here that says buyer part of the compensation?
No, because the buyer part of the compensation is an agreement between the buyer and the brokerage. And this document is between a buyer and a seller. So the seller doesn't care what you had agreed to pay your buyer.
I see. Okay.
So it's always very important, right? And I think that as a broker, one of the things that I see the most is that people confuse who are the principals on a document. Listing agreement, seller, listing agent, broker. Buyer agency agreement, buyer agent, broker. Contract, buyer and seller. That's it, right? We don't need to see any opinions or any names written about the buyer or the buyer's agent or the listing agent on this document, right? Because you cannot force a third party to validate or fulfill a contract in which that party did not sign. So if you say,
I'm sorry, Virginia, but that's not entirely true, because this is now not just between the seller and the buyer, but it's also between the seller and the buyer's agent.
This is between the buyer and the seller, because the buyer is responsible for paying that amount. The seller is saying, I'm giving you a concession the same way they are giving a subsidy, right? But I don't know what you have in your agreement. You're on your own in terms of if it's more, if it's less, if it doesn't match the number, right?
But I'm contracting here with I can go and cross the seller's whatever, 8% out and put 10 in. So I'm contracting with the seller here as the buyer's agent. Am I not?
It's the buyer. That is the one time where the kind of the table turns, and it's almost like the buyer is negotiating on your behalf. It's not you. Yeah, because you're not signing this document. This is a document signed by the buyer. So the buyer is negotiating how much of the compensation that they agreed to pay you is going to be paid by the seller.
Okay. Thank you.
But that's a really good question. Thank you, because there is a lot of confusion about that. Okay, so financing contingency. The contract is contingent or is not contingent on financing. So you have to mark one or the other. If it's a cash offer and you have put 100% on the down payment, right? If you had 100% here and 0 here, then it would be not contingent, right? Or maybe you have financing, but the contract is still not contingent, right? So you have to decide with your client whether they want to make the contract contingent or not on financing. As we know, depending again, if it's a seller's market or a buyer's market, that might change, right? If the contract is contingent on financing, then you have these caveats. Buyer will make written application for the financing and any lender required property insurance no later than 7 days after date of ratification. And it's really important that you remind your buyer. The buyer gets excited, the contract gets ratified, and they ratified when they were boarding a plane to go to a week-long vacation in the Bahamas. And then they forget to send the EMD, they forget to send the information to the lender because now we're ratified and life is great. Well, you have to remind them, right, that these things still need to happen. You need to send the EMD, you need to complete the application for financing, because if not, the buyer can be in default, okay? So always remind them that there is that clock ticking for the financing to complete the application. People remember the EMD really well, but sometimes people forget to remind their clients about this written application within 7 days. And the buyer grants permission for buyer's brokerage and the lender to disclose to the listing brokerage and seller general information available about the progress of the loan application and loan approval process. And this is a very interesting one, right? So you don't have the option here in some of the other contracts. You actually have the option to let your agent give permission to share information with the listing broker and with the seller. In Virginia, you're basically automatically giving permission. So it's really important that you have a conversation with the lender about what is appropriate to share and what is not appropriate to share, okay? And, there are some general guidelines. And again, here they talk about general information. You would be shocked to see how many lenders overshare information about their clients that is not general and might actually not even be relevant to the transaction, right? And that creates huge exposure to the contract and to all the parties involved. So that you're given permission, your buyer is given permission that you're going to share with the listing broker and the seller general information, not you, the lender, about the loan approval process, okay? So make sure that they understand that. Appraisal contingency. The contract is contingent or is not contingent. And again, in both cases for financing and for appraisal, if you're making the contract contingent, then you have to add the addendum, okay? So that's why it says addendum attached. So don't say is contingent and then don't include the addendum, right? Because then you're not doing your job correctly. So if you have a financing contingency or you have an appraisal contingency, make sure that you include the addendum, okay? So
Question,
you can
Virginia. In Virginia is if you add a financing contingency, is the appraisal automatically covered like it is in DC? Or is it just not contingent on appraisal period, even if you have a financing contingency?
That depends on the type of the loan, not so much on the contract.
I see. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like if you just add a financing contingency, you are automatically covered on the appraisal, which in DC we tell our clients, oh, you don't have to put an additional appraisal contingency because it's already covered under the financing.
Well, you still need to carve that out if you want to have the right to negotiate. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So if contract is contingent on financing and or appraisal, right? So it's not automatic, it's and or. Seller will provide appraiser reasonable access to property for appraisal purposes. If contract is not contingent on financing and or appraisal, seller will or will not provide appraiser reasonable access. So it's a seller's market, and you say, hey, I don't need an appraisal contingency. However, my lender, Cornelia, going back to your question, right? My lender requires an appraisal. It's not contingent. The contract is not contingent, but my lender is requiring that I do an appraisal. Can you give me access, right? So when you complete this section, you're going to say it's not contingent. However, the seller will give the appraiser access to the property, okay? So the contingency is not tied to whether the loan requires an appraisal or not, okay? The contingency only gives you the right to negotiate in case the appraisal comes in low, okay? If contract is not contingent on appraisal, buyer will proceed to settlement without regard to appraisal. Seller and buyer authorize broker to release sales price to appraiser who contacts them to obtain the information. Nothing in this subparagraph creates a financing contingency not otherwise agreed to by the parties. So again, the contract is not contingent on appraisal. The bank requires an appraisal. They do the appraisal comes in low. The lender says, well, now you only qualify for $800,000, right? And you have to bring not only the down payment, but the difference, because we're not going to give you more than the value of $800,000. And the buyer says, I don't have the money, and the contract falls through, you're not protected. That buyer is not protected because you did not have an appraisal contingency. So make sure that you and your client understand how the appraisal contingency can work out. The fact that you did an appraisal does not mean that you have the right to negotiate on an appraisal unless you have the contingency. Buyer representation. Buyer will or will not occupy the property as buyer's principal residence. Unless specified in a written contingency, neither contract nor the financing is dependent or contingent on the sale and settlement or lease of another property, right? So we have seen many cases where the seller needs to sell their house to buy something else, or the buyer needs to sell their house to buy this house. But if you don't make that a specific contingency, then the fact that you're going to occupy or not occupy the property doesn't necessarily automatically create a carve out or a contingency for this to happen. Buyer acknowledge that seller is relying upon buyer's representations, including without limitation the accuracy of financial or credit information given to seller, broker, or the lender by buyer. Deposit, buyer's deposit in the amount of, you have to click here, right? If it's going to be an actual number for a check or bank wire funds, or you click here if it's going to be a note due and payable on a specific date, okay? Will be held in escrow by the following escrow agent. You have the option to choose the settlement agent, the buyer's broker, or other. If you are with Keller Williams Capital Properties, we do not hold escrow money to protect you of possible liability and exposure. So if you are with Keller Williams Capital Properties, we always ask our agents to say that the escrow agent is going to be the settlement agent, okay? And then you have the option to say the buyer has already delivered deposit to escrow agent or will deliver deposit to escrow agent within X business days after ratification. So if you say 2 days, 3 days, make sure that that money is in there before the deadline expires. If buyer fails to timely deliver deposit to escrow agent as provided here, seller may, not will, may, at seller's option, deliver to buyer notice to void the contract, right? So you put 3 days, 3 days came and went, the money was not deposited. The seller has the option, but it's not automatic, to say, I'm going to send you a notice to void the contract because you did not send the money. That notice is unilateral. So you are exposing your client, if they don't send the money, that this could come at any point, right? So don't be surprised if you're like, why am I getting a notice to void the contract? Well, your buyer didn't deliver the deposit on time. So this is a unilateral notice, and it automatically, if it's delivered, automatically voids the contract. Okay, don't be surprised, and don't be like, no, they are sending it tomorrow. Well, the contract is void. You can write a new contract and go on the contract again, but that's done. Upon delivery of seller's notice to void contract, all respective rights and obligations of the parties arising under the contract will terminate, not may terminate, will. So it's done. However, buyer may cure the default by delivering deposit to escrow agent prior to seller delivering the notice. So let's say that you said 3 days, and 3 days came and went, and you have not received a notice, and you say, hey, buyer, we are totally exposed at any point. The seller may deliver notice. Send your money. If they send the money on day 4, and you have not received that notice from the seller, then you're good, right? You have the right to cure before you get that notice, right? But you're exposing your client to be totally, out of contract at that point. Any questions about that? Okay. Deposit will be deposited by escrow agent into an escrow account in accordance with applicable state and federal laws. This account may be interest-bearing, and all parties waive any claim to interest resulting from the deposit. Deposit will be held in escrow until one of all these things happen. One is credited towards sales price at settlement, right? That's the easiest and what we are all hoping for. 2, all parties have agreed in writing as to how it will be disposed, right? So again, if the contract gets voided or, canceled for any reason, one thing is the notice is provided. I give you notice, or we have an agreement in terms of terminating the contract. That is separate from how the money will be allocated, right? So a lot of times I hear people say, well, we canceled the contract. You still need to decide how the money will be allocated between the parties, okay? Option 3, a court of competent jurisdiction orders the disbursement of and all appeal periods have expired or is disposed in any other manner authorized by law. Seller and buyer agree that no escrow agent will have any liability to any party on account of disbursement of deposit or in account of failure to disburse deposit, except in the event of escrow agent's gross negligence or willful misconduct. So if the escrow agent went and spent the money, obviously that's gross negligence and willful misconduct. However, if you are battling between the buyer and the seller and there is a court order to dispose the money, at that point, the title company or the escrow agent doesn't need your permission anymore. They will disburse the funds. And basically the buyer is saying, I'm not going to come after you because you did what the court said you would do. Seller and buyer further agree that escrow agent will not be liable for the failure of any depository in which deposit is placed, and that seller and buyer each will indemnify, defend, and save harmless escrow agent from any loss or expense arising out of the holding, disbursement, or failure to disburse deposit, except in the case of escrow agent's gross negligence and willful misconduct. All right, any questions on deposit? Okay, one issue that I see happening all the time, and again, you have to think about, you have an obligation to the transaction and to your client. I see sometimes that people say, well, I'm not going to send the deposit until I do the home inspection. That's not correct. Okay, if you said 3 days, you have to send the money within 3 days. If you if you put 3 days in there and then you do the home inspection on day 4 and you're like, yeah, I'm just going to wait and sell the money after that, then if that is your intent, then put maybe 6 days on when you're going to send the deposit and do your inspection in 2 days, right? But if you have 3 days to send the deposit and your inspection is on day 4, make sure the buyer understands that the expectation is that that money is sent within 3 days. If then you do your home inspection, you decide to cancel, you sign the release, and the buyer will get their money back. But don't let the buyers are always going to push you to say, I don't want to send the money until I do my home inspection. Well, then let's have a conversation about that. And let's make sure that the dates reflect that in the agreement, okay? But if you're putting something on the contract, make sure that you're fulfilling that obligation. I see that happening a lot, and it's unfortunate that the agents are basically being sloppy, right? You're letting your client not fulfill one of the contract obligations. So be careful. Settlement. Seller and buyer, again, there is no buyer agent, no listing agent, right? The contract is between a buyer and a seller. Will make full settlement in accordance with the terms of the contract on or with mutual consent before. So it's on or before, right? The settlement date. So let's say that you put March 30th in there. Everybody has the expectation that you will close on March 30th. If for some reason the lender and the buyer are ready on the 27th, you can call the listing agent and say, hey, we're ready on our end. Would the seller be interested in closing early? If the seller agrees, then you can close early. But it's on or before by mutual consent. If you're not going to close by the 30, you need to have a settlement extension. Don't go in there without an extension. The amount of times that I see, well, the settlement date came and went, and we had a disagreement about a final walkthrough item. Did you sign an extension? No, we didn't. You are in this gray area that creates a lot of headaches. So if you're not going to close by the settlement date, write an addendum saying buyer and seller agree to extend the settlement date to on or before April 5th, right? But keep the contract tight, because the first thing that happens when we receive a complaint, either from the commission or a lawsuit, right, a demand from an attorney, the first thing that we're going to do is send me the contract, send me the listing agreement if you're on the listing side, or send me your buyer agency agreement. Any discrepancies in there create exposure for you and therefore for us as well. And sometimes, I hear people saying, KW has one of the most strict compliance, rules out there. All the other brokerages are much more lax. Well, we still get a lot of issues. Being one of the, most strict about compliance, we still get a lot of issues. So please, please, please keep the contract clean, organized, all the dates. If you need to extend the settlement, just write the addendum. And I promise you, it's going to make your life much easier. All right. If settlement date falls on a day other than a business day, then settlement will occur on the prior business day. So when you were writing the contract, you were super excited and you said March 30th, you didn't realize that that was a Saturday or a Sunday. Well, it's not the Monday, right? It's the Friday before. So make sure that you understand that your client understands that the lender understands that, right? It's really important. These things matter. People think they don't matter, but they do matter. Notice to buyer regarding the Real Estate Settlement Agent Act. Choice of settlement agent. This is something that was added recently, but basically this is a big disclaimer saying that, the buyer has the right to choose the settlement agent for the closing transaction. So you're going to see some people saying the seller prefers this title company, and you can say, congratulations, that's wonderful. My client is choosing to work with this title company, right? You have the right to do that. If the buyer feels ambivalent and they don't care and they are okay working with the title company that the seller recommends, that's fine. If they are going to work with a title company that you, as the agent, recommends, make sure that they also understand that if it's one of the title companies that we have affiliated businesses with, that when they sign the affiliated business disclosure, that they understand that there is a business relationship between that title company and us, okay? But if the listing agent tells you the seller prefers this title company, that does not mean that the buyer has to agree to work with that title company. Buyer notice to seller. So after the disclosure, right, buyer designates this title company as the settlement agent. Buyer agrees to contact the settlement agent within 10 days after verification to schedule settlement. I do not recommend that you wait the 10 days because scheduling settlement is one thing, but the title company does something much more important than that, which is to search the title and clear the title. So you don't want to be scrambling, especially if you have a tight closing. Let's say that you're going to close in 21 days. Waiting 10 days to notify the title company is a really long time, right? So notify them as soon as you go under contract. Here, basically, they are saying you're going to schedule the closing within 10 days, but make sure that you're in communication with the settlement company frequently so you avoid any delays. The worst thing that can happen is that 2 days prior to closing, the settlement company says there is a lien on the property that needs to be cured before we go to closing. Or there is a cloud on title. We need to find this family member that supposedly has a claim on the property. You really don't want that fire drill at the 11th hour. So the earlier that you start that process, the better. Pursuant to the Virginia law, settlement agent is the sole agent responsible for conducting the settlement as defined in the Virginia Code. Delivery of the required funds and executed documents to the settlement agent will constitute sufficient tender of performance. Funds from this transaction at settlement may be used to pay off any existing liens and encumbrances, including interest as required by lender or lien holders, right? So if the seller says, oh, yeah, no, I will pay my mortgage, the balance of the mortgage after we close. Now, the title company is authorized to pay all those liens and the mortgage prior to closing. Why? Because the title has to convey free and clear of any liens, right? The buyer has the right to acquire the property with a title that is free and clear. Sometimes you're going to hear, we need to do an exception on title. What that means is that there is something on the title, there is a cloud on the title, so you have the title company and then you have the title underwriter, right? There are 3 title underwriters in the country that do 95% of the transactions, right? North American Title, there are 3 big ones. The title company sees a cloud on the title, and when they send it to the title underwriter might say, well, we are not going to provide title insurance for this property, or we're going to provide title insurance with an exception. When you take title with an exception, and I encourage you to talk to a title attorney or to take a contracts class with a title company if you want more information about this. But if the title underwriter or the title company tells you the buyer has to take title insurance with exception, you need to understand what that exception is. Because basically what is going to happen is that if the buyer buys title insurance, but there is an exception, then if you at any point need to make a claim against that title policy, they will say, well, we told you that we were going to cover all these things except this one thing. So the buyer needs to understand that, okay? I'm not suggesting that you get in the middle of that conversation. What I'm suggesting is if the title company tells you there is an exception on the title insurance, you have to say to the buyer, talk to the title company. They need to explain what this means to you. Don't get in the middle, but you are the bridge, right? You need to make sure that they have that conversation. Down payment. Down payment will be paid on or before the settlement date by certified or cashier's check or by bank wire funds as required by settlement agent. An assignment of funds will not be used without prior written consent of the seller. So, if you're closing tomorrow, make sure that your clients send the money today or tomorrow morning at the latest, but ideally the day before. Okay. So you want to avoid fire drills at the 11th hour. As a best practice, tell your clients, and I would say that multiple times. One, when you sign your buyer agency agreement. Two, when you go under contract. Three, when they send when they send the EMD. Four, when they are about to send all the money to the title company. You have to tell them, do not use a link that you get on your phone. Do not follow an email that you receive on your inbox saying, here is the information to send the money. Do not use any of that. Most title companies have a secure encrypted platform. They are going to ask you to log into that platform. The information will be there. If you receive an email and you believe the email is legit because everything looks normal, call the title company and confirm that those are the instructions. Because there is a lot of scams out there, and they create an email address that looks like the title company, but it's not, right? It might have one character that looks different. And if the buyer is not paying attention, they are going to be sending the money to the wrong people, okay? So remind them, please use the encrypted platforms or call the title company and confirm the information with them on the phone. It's really important that you remind them of that. All right, delivery. This paragraph specifies the general delivery requirements under the contract. For delivery of property or condominium owner association documents, delivery may be to buyer as set forth below or to the buyer's agent, right? There is a lot of conversation. What is proper delivery? They send it to the agent, but the agent forgot to send it to the buyer, right? If they send it to you, that is proper delivery, okay? Delivery, which is also delivery or delivered methods, may include hand carried, sent by professional courier services, by the US mail, fax, believe it or not, email transmission. The parties agree that delivery will be deemed to have occurred on the day, delivery by hand, delivered by professional courier, blah, 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 either of which produces a tangible record of the transmission. So it doesn't mean acknowledgement, right? So if you say, well, you sent it to me 3 days ago, but I only acknowledge it today, as long as they have tangible record of transmission, that counts. So when you are on the listing side, as a best practice, what I recommend and what I do is you copy yourself, right? So if you're sending condo documents and you're the listing agent, copy yourself, because then you're going to get that email back and say, here it is. It didn't bounce back. It's here, right? Like, here is my confirmation of delivery. You can also obviously go to your sent items, but if you want to make sure that it was delivered, copy yourself as a best practice on the listing aid. And on the buyer side, pay attention to that. Deliveries will be sent as follows. You have two options. A, address to seller at property address unless otherwise specified below by US mail, courier, fax, email to seller. And then if it's email, you put the seller's email in there. Address to buyer by the same ways. No party to contract will refuse delivery in order to delay or extend any deadlines established in the contract. Okay. Virginia Residential Property Disclosure Act. The Virginia Residential Property Disclosure Act requires sellers to deliver a disclosure statement prior to the acceptance of contract unless the transfer of property is exempt. The law requires sellers on a disclosure statement provided by the real estate board to state that sellers makes no representations or warranties concerning the physical condition of the property and to sell the property as is, except as otherwise provided in the contract. Okay? So the seller has to deliver the disclosure unless they are exempt. And you have a list of exemptions, but the most common is if is an estate attorney, for example, right? Or a representative, okay? Virginia Resale Disclosure Act Seller represents that the property is or is not located within a development that is subject to the Virginia Property Owners Association Act. Seller represents that the property is or is not located within a development that is subject to the Virginia Condominium Act. Okay? So you have the POAA or you have the Condo Act that will apply whether the property is a condo, a townhouse, and if it's not, then you put that is not in both cases. Provisions under this section allow for buyer cancellation of contract under the following circumstances. Until 9 p.m., X number of days after day of ratification, if seller or seller's brokerage delivered the resale certificate to buyer or buyer's agent, whether or not complete, this is critical, right? Or a notice that the resale certificate is unavailable before date of ratification, okay? The default is 3 days. So, they say, well, I did receive the documents, but they were not complete. So the time frame is not, the clock is not, it doesn't start ticking because the documents were not complete. That's not true, okay? The clock starts ticking, and it's your responsibility to make sure that those documents are complete, or that if the buyer has any hesitation, that they use their contingencies in a timely manner. The buyer can always say, I'm out because you did not provide complete documents, or send me the complete documents and then I stay in the contract, right? But make sure that this happens very quickly. These 3 days timelines happen very quickly. So you have to be on top of it. Option
Excuse
two,
me, Virginia, question to that. I recently had a case where we delivered the documents. I ordered them from the management company. They were delivered, and then the buyer's agent, I was on the list side, the buyer's agent was like, well, I didn't see the email you sent last night, so I'm not going to count yesterday as, the delivery. But if you can show it in an email, that's what it is, right? The delivery, whether she saw the email or not. She claimed she didn't see it, she didn't get it, but
Yeah.
we had clear, list of people that received it, and I said we sent it to the buyer as well. So that's not in question, right?
It's not in question, and they say, well, I'm not going to count it. You can say wonderful, right? But if there is a complaint and this goes in front of a judge, the judge is not going to count it. They say you are counting it, right? So
what do you do if they refuse to sign an acknowledgement? There's this acknowledgements page that and she refused to sign it.
I mean, you go back to this, right? You have proof, tangible record of the transmission.
Okay. All right. And then my second question is, it turns out there were documents missing, or actually, I'm not sure whether they are mandatory. Meeting minutes were missing, and the latest updated budget was missing. So is it still counting from the day that they were delivered, even though there were documents that were missing?
Unfortunately, yes. Right. So this is new to the contract. Before there was no clarification whether the clock would start ticking until the documents were complete, and there was a lot of back and forth about that. But now they made the clarification whether or not complete. So you have to tell your client, listen, the budget is missing. If that is a concern to you, we have multiple options. We can request an extension of the condo review period, right? Okay. We can cancel the contract. What would you like to do? Remember, you don't make decisions. You advise your client. Right. But if my recommendation is the moment that you get them, you look at them. If you see anything is missing, automatically that same day, you say, and you can put a random number. I need 15 days extension to review the condo documents. And they are going to say, what? You're like, well, you did not provide complete documents. I need to protect my client. So the best way to obtain a reaction would be to ask for something that they will be like, what are you talking about? You're like, you did not provide complete documents. So I need to protect my client, and they have the right to review these documents under pressure, right? Without pressure. So
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not always obvious how, whether there's anything missing. Are the meeting minutes mandatory in the disclosure?
no.
No, they're not. But a budget isn't. They gave us a budget, but just not the updated latest one. And it was like beginning of the year, so it maybe wasn't ready yet. I don't know. But
It has to be the most recent budget that was approved, right? So that's what is required. So it happens a lot in January that, people, they send you a document and then 2 weeks later there is a new one. You could always ask before closing, is there an updated budget, right?
Okay.
Especially if the closing is going to be for an extended period of time instead of like, 25 to 30 days. If you have like a 60-day closing, I would definitely ask, hey, has anything changed from the
So-
last conduct?
Right. So Virginia, now let's say we're at the closing table and it turns out, 2 days ago they just issued a new budget. Does the buyer then have any recourse and can say, I wasn't given the latest budget, I'm not moving forward, or is that door shut?
I think that's a really good question. So I would say if it's a material fact that is known to the seller, they have to disclose. So let's say, they deliver the condo documents, everything was great. The day prior to closing, there is an earthquake, right? And the building is compromised, and now the seller has knowledge. They have to disclose that.
Yeah, okay. So in this case, the seller didn't know that it wasn't the latest budget. So let's say theoretically, we're now at the closing table. The buyer says, oh, 2 days ago, I just got the new budget. I'm not going forward. I'm not buying. I don't like the new budget. Is there any leg to stand on, or is the review of the documents satisfied within the 3 days that they had?
I mean, I think that, that falls into the gray space. And I think there has to be a conversation about what is it that you don't like about the budget, right? Like there has to be a reason. You cannot
Right.
say if you're using that just because you got cold feet, it's not going to fly.
Right. But as a seller and a seller's agent, I have fulfilled all my obligations. I haven't done anything wrong, right?
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm. Okay. Okay, I think we were here until 9 p.m. X number of days after the day the seller or seller's brokerage delivered the resale certificate to the buyer, whether or not complete. That was the same. Or 3, at any time prior to settlement, if the resale certificate is not delivered to buyer or buyer's agent. If the unit is governed by more than one association, the time frame for buyer's rights of cancellation shall run from the date of delivery of the last resale certificate. So if they have 2 set of documents and you deliver the first one but not the second one, then the time frame is for the second one. This is when they are governed by more than one association. Okay, not when one document is missing. For more information, CK 1390, Understanding Your Rights under the Resale Disclosure Act. Property management and maintenance and condition inspections, except as otherwise specified here, seller will deliver property free and clear of trash and debris, broom clean, and in substantially the same physical condition to be determined as of the day of the offer, the day of the home inspection, or other. If no date is selected, then date of offer. So if you don't put anything in there, the default is the day of the offer. Seller will have all utilities in service through settlement. Buyer and seller will not hold broker liable for any breach of this paragraph. Buyer acknowledges that except as otherwise specified in contract, property including electrical, plumbing, existing appliances, heating, air conditioning equipment, and fixtures will convey in as-is condition as of the day specified above. Okay? So if they say, oh, the electricity is not on, they are responsible to make sure the utilities are connected unless it's agreed, and that the property is free and clear of trash and debris, broom clean. There is a lot of discussion about what broom clean is and the nails on the walls, right? make sure that your client has clear expectations. It's not a professional cleaning, it's just broom cleaning. So here is where the buyer will say, contract is contingent upon a home inspection, right? And then you have to include that addendum, or the buyer waives the opportunity to make the contract contingent upon home inspection and other inspections of the property. If contract is contingent upon home inspection, seller will provide inspector retained by the buyer reasonable access to the property to conduct inspection. This is where it becomes interesting, right? If contract is not contingent, seller will not provide access to anyone for the purpose of conducting inspections, except for the final walkthrough as provided below. So you always have that buyer that says, I want to go and measure, and the seller actually has the right to say, no, I'm sorry, right? You don't have access, you don't have permission to access the property. I have seen cases where when you go under contract, if there are no contingencies, they actually remove the lockbox. So make sure that your client doesn't get flustered or angry, like the seller is being difficult. Well, maybe, but contractually they have the right to do that, right? So if you want to have access to the property, you need to have that home inspection contingency carved out, right? However, if checked, seller will provide a broker, buyer, and licensed, if applicable, professional insurance inspectors retained by the buyer reasonable access to the property to conduct a home inspection and or other inspections of the property, beginning on and ending on, right? Sometimes people put dates, sometimes they put dates and time, right? And between today at 10 a.m. until tomorrow at 3 p.m. So again, if you don't like it, make sure that you negotiate it, right? Like you have the right to change those terms if your clients do not like the tight deadline that the seller is giving you to access the property. Regardless of whether contract is contingent upon a home inspection and other inspections, seller will provide broker and buyer reasonable access to property for the final walkthrough within 7 days prior to settlement or occupancy, whichever occurs first. So if you said no contingencies, nobody goes into the house, the seller still has to give access for that final walkthrough. Possession, unless otherwise agreed to in writing between the buyer and the seller will give possession of the property at settlement, including delivery of keys, mailbox, key fobs, codes, and everything else. If seller fails to do so and occupies the property beyond settlement, seller will be a tenant and at sufferance of buyer, and hereby expressly waives all notices to quit as provided by law. So what happens is like closing is at 12, but I still have 3 boxes. Can I go back to the house and retrieve my boxes after closing? Technically, no, right? So make sure right now, because we're reviewing the buyer's contract, the sales contract with the angle of your being a buyer's agent, make sure you go back to the listing agent and say, hey, is everything out of the house? Can you confirm that everything is out? Can you confirm the sellers will be out of there, right? Because if not, you're creating headaches for your client that is unnecessary. Utilities, check all that apply. So again, these normally you get from the listing, right? So make sure that you include all this, whether the water is public or well, hot water, what kind of system, air conditioning, heating, sewage, right? We see a lot of cases in which the buyer is like, I didn't know the property was in septic. Well, if you left this section blank, again, you might be exposing your client to problems in the future. So my rule of thumb is try to complete as much information as possible, leave as little blank as possible, okay? Personal property and fixtures. Property includes the following personal property and fixtures, if existing, built-in heating and central air. The expectation is that that conveys plumbing and light fixtures. Any light fixtures that are attached to the property, the expectation is that they convey. If you have the antique chandelier from grandma and you do not want that to convey, make sure it's included in here. Does not convey. That's why you have this section here, right? What does not convey? Otherwise, the expectation is that it will convey, okay? Sprinkler systems, bathroom mirrors, sump pump, exhaust fan, storm door, storm windows, doors, screens, wall-to-wall carpeting, window shades, blinds, treatments. Again, if they have a very expensive window treatment and they do not want to leave it behind, it has to be specified. Smoke and heat detectors, antennas, trees, shrubs, and all that good stuff. Here you're going to say not only whether it is included, a microwave, but the number, right? So if it's 1, you're going to put yes and 1. And if it's no, you can just leave it blank. But, a lot of times kitchens have, houses have 2 kitchens or 2 washer and dryers, right? So make sure that that is specified in there, because you don't want to assume that 2 washers and dryers convey, but the seller was only planning to leave 1 and take the other one, okay? Other conveyances, right, as is, no additional value, and for seller convenience, or does not convey. If there is a fuel tank on the property, mark it in there. If it's leased, the lease number, right, and the number. Lease items, any lease items, systems, or services, including but not limited to fuel tanks, water treatment systems, lawn contracts, security system, satellites, do not convey absent an express written agreement by buyer and seller. The following is the list of leased items within the property. So if there is any lease items, make sure that you include them in there. If you leave the section blank, the assumption is that there will be no leased items conveying with the property. FERPA, this is only for foreign sellers, right? So if you are, for example, with the World Bank, or if you are a diplomat and you're subject to FERPA, the title company needs to know, and everybody has to be on notice that the seller is or is not a foreign person for tax purposes. The way that works is that if you are subject to FERPA, the buyer may be required to withhold and pay to the Internal Revenue Service up to 15% of the sales price. So why is this important? I get this question all the time. Well, the seller is subject to FERPA. I don't care. I'm the buyer. Well, the reason why you care is because you are the one sending the money to the title company. So you're basically instructing the title company to withhold up to 15% of that money that you're sending, right, of that $1 million, for the title company to wait until the IRS makes a determination whether the seller has to pay that money or not. So people get shocked because they're like, why are you withholding 15% of my proceeds? Well, you're subject to FERPA, and we need to make sure that we get a letter from the IRS determining whether you have to pay this or not, okay? If you're not comfortable talking about FERPA, just refer the buyer or the seller to the title company. They have a lot of experience. They can deal with it. Don't express an opinion if you're not comfortable, or even if you're comfortable, it's better to direct them to the title company. Smoke detectors. Seller will deliver the property with smoke detectors installed and functioning in accordance with the laws and regulations of Virginia, okay? So the smoke detector not only has to be installed, it has to be functioning, okay? So if it has no battery, you or the seller have to put batteries on the smoke detectors. Lead-based paint. Seller represents that any residential dwellings at the property were or were not constructed prior to 1978. If the property were constructed before, then unless exempt, the property is considered target housing under the statute, and a copy of the sale disclosure and acknowledgement of information of lead-based paint has to be included as part of the contract. And then the buyer is going to, does or does not waive the right to do a risk assessment or inspection of the property for the presence of lead-based paint, okay? If not, a copy of the sales contract addendum for lead-based paint testing is attached to establish the conditions of the lead-based paint risk assessment or inspections. Wood destroying insects, non-buyer at buyer's expense or sellers at seller's expense will furnish a written report for a licensed pest control company dated no more than 90 days prior to settlement, showing that the dwelling within the property is free of visible evidence of life with destroying insects and free from visible damage. So what happens, right? We see this all the time. Well, the pest company said that they were dead termites. You have to do a treatment. Do I? Right? It says free of visible evidence of live termites or damage. So if you have live termites, you have to treat. If there is damage, you have to cure the damage. But if they are dead and there was no damage, technically the seller doesn't have to do anything. Seller will provide buyer, broker, and any representatives of the licensed pest control firm selected by the appropriate party above reasonable access to the property to perform the wood destroying insect inspection, any treatments for live wood destroying insects, and or repairs for any damage identified in the report will be made at seller's expense, and seller will provide written evidence of such treatment or repair prior to the date of settlement, which will satisfy the requirement in this paragraph. So if the seller didn't do it and they are like, oh, I'll do it after, right? The contract calls for this to be done prior to. If they already pay for it, but the pest company cannot get there until the day of closing, again, explain the rights and obligations to the buyer, right, for this section. Gesal?
Thank you, Virginia. In regard to smoke detectors, since we primarily do rentals, does the seller have to have the smoke detectors inspected and brought up to code in Virginia? Or just have whatever smoke detector is there to make sure they stay there and they're functional?
I think, I'm trying to remember. Mike, do you know if they need to be up to code? I don't think they need to be up to code. I think they need to be operational.
And
Right.
what if there were no smoke detectors in the house when they
They have
listed?
to install them.
Okay,
Thank you, Mike.
sure.
All right, home warranty. Yes or no, home warranty policy selected by buyer or seller and paid for and provided at settlement by buyer or seller cost not to exceed this amount provided by X. So I had a case the other day where somebody called me and they said, well, we said the home warranty was going to be up to $850, but the seller was so cheap and they bought one that was $400. They had all these other options like riders that they could add up, right? They had this thing that they could add, the other thing. I want them to add all that because we said 850 and it only cost 400. And I said, unfortunately, it says up to, right? So unless you specify that you want the home warranty with this, and that add on, the seller only has to provide the most basic up to that amount, right? So if you want to make sure your client has the best one, make sure that it's specified in there and that is clear that you want these additional things added to the home warranty. Damage or loss, the risk of damage or loss of the property by fire, act of God, or other casualties remains with the seller until settlement. So you're closing at 3 p.m. If something happens at 2 p.m., it is the seller's responsibility. If it happens at 5 p.m., it is the buyer's responsibility. Cornelia? You had a question?
Accident. No question. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay. Title. Buyer will promptly order a title report as well as any required and desired survey. Fee simple title to property and everything that conveys with it will be sold free of liens except of any loans assumed by the buyer. This is what we were talking about before, right? The title has to convey free and clear of any liens. Seller will convey title that is good, marketable, and insurable. So you have three requirements: good title, marketable, insurable. Marketable means the title company can go and put it on the market and say, who is going to provide title underwriting for this title, right? That's what it is, marketable. And insurable. So one of the title underwriters are going to come back and say, I'll provide title insurance with no additional risk premiums to buyer or non-standard exceptions. This is what I was talking about before. If the title company says, I'll provide title, but with this additional premium or with this exception, The buyer needs to understand that, right? So they understand what they are dealing with. But the seller is required to provide good, marketable, and insurable title, free and clear of any liens. In case action is required to perfect the title, right? If something has to happen, there is a lien that needs to be cured, such action must be taken promptly by seller at seller's expense. So they did not pay the HVAC company, they put a lien on the property. Well, now that lien has to be cured prior to closing and it's the seller's expense. Title may be subject to easements, covenants, conditions, and restrictions of record, if any, as of the day of ratification. Seller will convey the property by general warranty deed with English covenants of title deed. The manner of taking title may have significant legal and tax consequences. Buyer is advised to seek appropriate professional advice concerning the matter of taking title. Seller will sign such affidavits, liens waivers, tax certifications, and other documents as may be required by the lender, title insurance company, settlement agent, government authorities, an authorized settlement agent to obtain payoff or assumption information for any existing lenders, right? So again, if you have any concerns that your client has questions about how to take title, what is title underwriting, how are they protected, tell them to talk to either the title company or to a title attorney. Do not provide advice because that is not our expertise and you don't want to say the wrong thing. Notice of possible filings of mechanical liens, permit persons who have performed labor or furnished materials for the construction, removal, repair, or improvement of any building or structure to file a lien. The Code of Virginia permits somebody that has performed a job in the property to file a lien against the property. This lien may be filed at any time after the work is commenced or the material is furnished, but no later than the earlier of 90 days from the last day of the month or 90 days from the time the construction, removal, or improvement is terminated. An effective lien for work performed prior to the day of settlement may be filed after settlement. Legal counsel should be consulted, right? So the seller says, well, I want to, change the HVAC system before I put my property on the market. They bring the company, the company does the work, they put the property on the market, the contractor doesn't, they don't get paid, the contractor files this after closing, again, and your client calls you and they're like, what happened? At that point, you have to say, hey, I'm so sorry this happened. You need to seek legal counsel, okay? And don't be afraid to say that. I will be more than happy to have those conversations with your clients if you are unsure or if you don't want to have that conversation on your own. Fees, seller will pay for deed preparation, cost to release any existing encumbrances, grantor's tax, as well as any regional congestion relief fee, regional WMATA, capital fee, and all those beautiful fees. Buyer will pay for the title exam, survey, recording charges for deed, and any purchase money trust. You always have the option to provide a seller net sheet and a buyer estimated cost, right? So have the conversation early because you don't want your buyer or your seller to say, oh, I didn't know about all these fees, right? So make sure that they understand the fees associated with selling the property. Broker compensation. Parties irrevocably instruct settlement agent to pay broker compensation at settlement set forth in parties' respective brokerage representation agreements. So I had a conversation the other day with one of our agents that had worked with a buyer for over 6 months. They submitted and voided multiple offers. And in the last one, after voiding the contract, they asked to be relieved from the buyer agency agreement. And the buyer said, I want to pursue or agent said, I want to pursue this buyer because I have wasted all this time. The way the buyer agency agreement is written is that unless you have a fixed amount per diem or, a fee for service, you are not going to get paid until closing, right? If it's a percentage of the transaction, you get paid at closing. So if you're concerned about that, go back to your buyer agency agreement and make sure that there is a fixed amount of that compensation that gets paid no matter what. But basically, in the contract, the buyer and seller are giving the title company permission to pay what the brokerage representation agreements indicate for each party. Adjustments, rent, taxes, water, sewer charges, condominium association fees will be prorated, right? Based on when the property closes. In the event the property is currently enrolled in a land use assessment program pursuant to the Virginia Code, by the actions of seller, property is deemed unqualified for such program, seller will be liable for the rollback taxes. Seller will not be liable for the payment of rollback taxes at or after settlement if buyer fails to continue property in the program or within the time frame required by local regulatory authority. Attorney's fees, if any party breaches the contract and a non-breaching party retains legal counsel to enforce its rights, the non-breaching party will be entitled to recover against the breaching party in addition to any other damages recoverable against any breaching party. So make sure that they understand this, right? All these legal provisions, we're not going to read them line by line, but it's important that you read them with them and that they understand these provisions. Default, if buyer fails to complete settlement for any reason other than default by seller, the buyer will be in default, and at the option of the seller, deposit may be forfeited to seller as liquidated damages. Make sure that your seller and your clients understand these provisions, because if they accept the deposit, they are basically accepting that that's the maximum amount of liquidated damages. If they want to pursue the buyers for more than that, then they should not be accepting the deposit, right? If they want a higher number, they should not be accepting the deposit. Void contract, if contract becomes void and of no further force and effect, without default by either party, both parties will immediately execute a release directing the deposit, if any, be refunded in full to buyer according to the terms of the deposit paragraph. And then definitions. This is really important that you read them and that you're comfortable with this. Why? I wouldn't tell you how many times I get a call or a text saying, hey, in Virginia, is the deadline 9? In Maryland, is it 6? Read the contract, right? First, I don't know what version of the contract you use. Second, right, like everything is in there and there is no room for interpretation. Everything is there. Ratification or ratified means delivery of the final acceptance in writing by buyer and seller of all the terms of the contract, which delivery date will be the day of ratification, not the date of the expiration or removal of any contingencies. For the purposes of determining the date of ratification can occur anytime between midnight and 11:59 of the delivery date. So some people are saying, well, it's past 9 p.m. It doesn't matter, right? It's up to 11:59, okay? So make sure that you understand the timeframes. For the purposes of computing time periods in response to delivery, the first day will be the day following delivery, and the time period will end at 9 p.m. of the specified date. So now it's not 11:59 anymore. Now it's 9, okay? So again, make sure that you understand this. Days and days mean calendar days unless otherwise specified in the contract. Did somebody have a question?
Yes, I do. The 9 p.m. in Virginia generally goes for everything, right? For expiring contingencies and all of that. Is that correct? Because in DC it's 6 p.m. now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you.
Mhm. Business days means any days that is not a Saturday or Sunday, legal holiday, or day in which the state or federal government office is closed. Okay. So again, if it only says days, it's calendar days. If it's not going to be calendar days, then it has to say business days. And that excludes Saturday, Sunday, and holidays. Okay. All references to times of day refer to Eastern time zone. Appraisal means written appraisal valuation. Legal expenses means attorney's fees, notices, right? Notice void in the contract. So make sure that you read and understand all this. Time is of the essence, right? Time is of the essence. So make sure that people are not waiting on you, right? One thing is that the seller is waiting for the buyer to respond, but make sure, especially when you have something, that you actually convey that information as soon as possible. Real estate license parties, if you have any relation to any of the parties of the contract, you have to disclose them, right? So the parties acknowledge that you is an active, inactive licensed real estate agent in Virginia and or other jurisdictions, and is either buyer, seller, or related to one of the parties in this transaction. Okay. Entire agreement basically said that, everything that was presented and agreed is the entire agreement. So if you intended or meant to have a buyer home inspection, you better make sure that it's included. Otherwise, your intention doesn't mean that they have to acknowledge that. Yes, Cornelia.
The real estate license parties, would you ever put your name in there and just state that you are an active licensed Virginia agent with no relationship to either the seller or buyer, or is that not necessary?
No, it's
No.
not necessary. But for example, sometimes people ask me, well, in what case would it be inactive? Because if it's inactive, the person is not writing a contract. Well, maybe the buyer's mom is an inactive real estate agent, right? And you actually want to disclose that, right? Why? Because the mom might be giving the buyer advice, even though she's not supposed to, because she doesn't have an active license. So it's kind of like situations like that. But if you're just working as an agent with no signature authority in the contract, and you're not related to them, then you don't have to put your name in there. What else? Additions. So this is where it becomes very interesting, right? Because you have all these additions and people fail to include the addendums that you want to include, but then they include them. So I always say, again, keep your contracts tight. If you said somewhere in the contract that you had a conventional financing and you are going to include the conventional financing addendum, make sure that you click that here, right? If you're including an escalation, click it in there, right? Make sure that this table is complete. If you have something else, you specify it here, okay? Date of ratification, again, it says see definitions. Why? Because they want to make sure that everybody understands when is the day of ratification. Is it today? Is it tomorrow? So you put the date in here, then you put the seller sign on one side, the buyers, and then for information purposes only, you have the listing agent information and the buyer agent information. Questions? And sorry, it's 1:30. I think the class was supposed to be 1 hour, but.
Yeah, I have one question. In the additions, the residential property disclosure statement is always in there, right? In the contract. Like you cannot have a contract without that.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. And the reason why they put it in here is because maybe the listing agent didn't provide it. So you might not have it, but you need it, right? So you as the buyer's agent need to make sure that that's provided to you.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. All right. Questions? I'm going to stop the share to see your beautiful faces and names. All right. Questions, comments, something that you learn, something that is not clear, something that you would like to share with everybody else.
Thank you, Virginia. It was very informative.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. All right. Well, if you think of any additional questions after the class that you didn't think about before, reach out to me. We have a lot of people in the team that can help you, and it's actually better to have a conversation prior to you making a mistake. If you have doubts, please reach out. We will be more than happy to walk you through this one more time and go over any questions that you may have. And thank you so much for coming to the class today. It's good to see so many people joining the class. So enjoy.
Virginia, one more question. Are you doing a class on the addendas, like the inspection, the financing, and all of that? Is that a separate class?
Yeah, that will be a separate class, and we will do that next month. So we try to rotate main contract addendums and then main contract addendums for each jurisdiction.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Virginia. I had one quick question.
Yeah.
In the event that the title can't be delivered clean to the buyer, does the buyer then have the right to walk away from the contract?
Yep. The contract calls for a clear and marketable title, free and of liens. So if that's not the case, you have grounds to cancel the contract.
Without penalty. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And it's really important that you explain that to your clients, because sometimes they don't know, they feel pressure, right? It's important that they understand what they are getting into. All right. Thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.